Hello everyone, today we talk about Carolingian coinage in the 9th century. So a bit of monetary history through which, as we will see, we can amazingly reconstruct some broader political and social dynamics, as well as military ones, of this troubled time, mostly of Frankish history, the century of the great crisis of the fragmentation of the empire, and also, however, of the same attempts from the side of these rulers to reassert their own authority, to secure it on a territorial basis, in which, as you know, minting was a quite important prerogative attached to. That is to say, whoever had the legal and most and public authorities was one of the few things that was universally public, at least, in the presence of, naturally, of power, could claim itself. So there would be, a great and gradual decentralization, privatization, quite important, but almost in a dynastic sense, based on local lords in minting rights, etc. But surely, mints were in the most important centers of an empire that was largely urbanized. Right, today we will also split fundamentally the perspective in the Western, the Eastern Frankish kingdoms, and the Italic one, that all have a different story. Let's say also there is this other, stripe, at least in between the first two, and connected to Italy, that was Lotharingia, right, arriving up to Frisia, the North Sea, that also lived, as you know, historically as a sort of frontier area where no power would develop centrally on its own, differently from other sub-kingdoms, such as, for example, Aquitaine, that wasn't even properly such, but also other minor powers that survived, at least for a while, as a royal institution, that is the Kingdom of Arles/Burgundy. And as we were saying before, through coinage history, we can understand really a lot about these dynamics. So we start, of course, with the century that also coincides, as you know, with Charlemagne's coronation as emperor by Pope Leo III in Rome at Christmas of the same 880, which, interestingly enough, was not reflected in the Frankish coinage. Right, about this we should make other videos, but at the time, in spite of the imperial title of Charlemagne, Frankish coinage continued to accord Charlemagne the title of Rex Francorum. Right, this is important also in the broader history of Carolingian coinage, as the Frankish and not the Roman character of the empire was evident, in a sense, also at an ideological level. It would be the Ottonians that revived the Romanity of properly the ethnic concept of the empires in that universal sense, and that incidentally would spread, would carry out an intense amount of minting and properly monetary circulation and spread, especially in areas where, as we will see in Carolingian times, like Germany, basically didn't have much, if not in the most Romanized, Frankicized areas of the West and the South. And it's only on Pope Leo the Third's own coinage of Rome, right, within Rome, that Charlemagne was accorded the title Imperator. On coins, we're talking about this, and his name was joined with that of the same Pope, marking the start of this new, let's say, papal/imperial coin series, though one that now looked rather towards the West and this renovatio of the same imperium than Constantinople. Right, here we're prevalently talking about, throughout the whole video, about the civil coinage. That was the dominating one. As we will see, the Carolingians actually revived the gold to compete with Constantinople and the Caliphate, etc. But the local realities were somewhat very different, as we will see, especially in Rome, the silver coin, especially, and also of lower weight compared to the Carolingian issue, would be reinstated at some point, probably in some previous Roman Roman series. And towards the end of Charlemagne's reign, possibly in 1812, when the Byzantine Emperor Michael I recognized Charlemagne's imperial title, but not the Roman one, then only at that point a new type was introduced, depicting a laureate bust of classical style. It's kind of the most famous of imperial of Carolingian iconography, I would say, in coinage, with the titles Imperator Augustus, right, and occasionally also Dominus Noster, is our Lord. So that is interesting because it connects the imperiality within the established within the coinage only as a sort of international recognition with a power was outside of Carolingian control. This type was continued by Louis the Pious, his son, right? That remained a sole ruler and therefore also, having the possibility of still uniforming as much as possible the coinage in the empire, ruling between 1814 and 1840. Louis the Pious additionally struck a small number of splendid gold solidi in the first 5 years of his reign, right? So the imperial pretensions here are clear, albeit, as you know, Louis the Pious' reign would grow further unstable in a way, and properly from an ideological point of view, also such symbolism such as the gold coin, but also some invocations on coinage such as Christiana Religio, and a special reference to this broader Louis the Pious was called like this also because of the emphasis on the ecclesiastical unity of reform, etc. As we have explained very often, this need for enlightened Carolingian rulers such Louis and his father to properly bet on the church as the only, namely non-transmissible asset, dynastically speaking, also with this important amount, of centralized administration compared to the lay clienteles on which the empire had traditionally based during the phase of expansion, continuous wars, was a very important tool to try to save, trying to provide the Carolingian Empire what it had never had, was properly a statal character, a public culture that in the Frankish world, in the feudal, would never take off as such. Albeit, of course, public figures existing by name and surviving also such as the same empire, right? Because that was to entice them not to be exploited also by later claims of legitimization, rulers, etc. And so the empire lived on in the West in that sense. Then Louis established other two recoinages in rapid succession in 1818 and in 822-23. And the second issue, with a mint name written across the field, that tells us lots of interesting things on a geographical base, was struck, in fact, at 45 mints, right, and enhanced to a standard weight of 1 grams circa, right? This apparently proved unviable. For the third type, with a characterized by a temple design, returned to the former 1.7 gram standards, right? And it remained in circulation for very long, some 40 years, from 822-23 also, until Charles the Bulb's reform of 1864 that we will see. And on the reverse, the mint name was suppressed in this third issue with the invocation of Christiana Religio, as we were saying before. And let's say only recently it's been possible to attribute at least a significant number of coins to specific mints, right? Although an important amount of them remains unidentified, but it's still meaningful. And this was a bit, as you understand, the standard, what remained since this moment of the last great moment of concrete rule more than just unity, right? It would be revived, namely at some point towards the very end with Charles the Fat, etc. But of the Carolingian rulers, and that also had, as we've seen, this symbolical invocation to the Christian religion, and therefore the unity and the harmony, the respect towards authority, and that Pious was claiming at that point. And in fact, despite the division of the empire, Ordinatio Imperii of 817, the coinage continued to be minted in Louis' name at all mints until his death in 840, where his sons had already rebelled. So a lot of problems, as had emerged at that point, and more would follow eventually with the final split, the Battle of Fontenoy, the Treaty of Verdun, and so on. This is significant because, as we were saying, it's as if that unitary imperial legacy had lived on, right? And there were a few exceptions to this. There were few and short-lived. In Aquitaine, so it was important because, as we will see, there wasn't like properly a centralized minting. Every region had different dynamics. Of course, there was a broader interest of keeping these of the empire together for trade, tax collection, and uniformity. The Carolingians worked a lot, at least in this early phase, for that. But still, the nature of local rule was based on the single, lordships, land owning, and individuals. And here, that's why Louis the Pious had fundamentally also issued smaller coinages in the name of various sons. For example, in the name of Pippin I, to mark his coronation as sub-king of Aquitaine in 817. So to provide that concrete power also in minting rights that was needed for those rules. The same thing had been done by the same Charlemagne for Louis when he was a child. At this point, the Carolingians were thinking about the future, in the sense that the Franks knew pretty much there was nothing to do in terms of curbing the ethnic tradition of splitting possessions, including the whole Carolingian Empire, to sons, and they knew how detrimental that had been. Charlemagne and Louis had been, say, lucky to have lost all their brothers, right? So that's why there was a Carolingian Empire as we know it in the first place, because that was not to be given for granted at all, considering the nature of Frankish rule. But there was this kind of prepaid, let's say, this compensation. Even think about Charles the Bald eventually, that was carved a smaller local power in Gaul for saying, okay, the bigger chunks should go to the main sons, then the lesser ones should have something tinier, otherwise we would split the empire into lots of pieces and it would fundamentally crumble again. It was, as you know, somewhat not a pointless effort because some major chunks are made, but as you know, eventually the broader post-Carolingian future would be fragmentation of decentralization, and so on the long run. But the Carolingians, say, at least tried their best in a sense, at least as long as they were, of those who were in control of the world, to secure some kind of smoother transition. Eventually, the following generations unavoidably started fighting against each other from their respective standpoint, their legacies, inheritances. Now, there are also two groups of coin in the name of Lothar appearing to have been minted during Louis the Pious' life still. One of these is a portrait issue, which probably also dates to the years 822-23, when Lothar was crowned king of Italy, and from which, as you know, he would rule eventually also as an emperor fundamentally, because that was the kingdom to which the imperial title was connected, and hence also the Lotharingia, because of the extra territory north of the Alps, as they were mentioning before, in addition to the Italic kingdom. The second group instead copies Louis Christiana Religio type, and it comes from Dorestad, right? This today ghost town that however, was incredibly important on today's would be Dutch coast, on the Frisian coast of the time. That became one of the single most important trade centers in the time. Eventually, the city literally disappeared. And then there are and it had historically also its own coinage at some point, and also there are other unidentified but surely at least non-Italian mints attributed to Lothar's at the time of Lothar's revolt of 833-34, right? What is actually striking, however, among all these this upheaval is that happened during his own reign is Louis' uniformity of strength of control over the coinage, over the minting administration up to 840. You know that these were moments probably of civil strife, etc. And probably, as we were saying before, much of this feat was probably connected to the same interests of the various sons, not to reject in total their father's legacy, albeit they deposed them. That it was quite of a, also Louis later reign became blind. It was all ferocious struggles, by the way, and ferocious contentions and feelings between the various in the family. We know that at this point coinage was plentiful, right? Hoards as well, deriving from these strifes that people treasured. They buried these this precious, and so we found them archaeologically. And this tell us that probably it was a free and rapid circulation of Louis issues throughout the empire, right? And this is really striking because in looking at the world medieval history, there was no such uniformity and freedom of circulation ever re-achieved, right? And this tells you how much the Carolingians in the last few generations had managed to make things work in this enormous area. And unavoidably, the situation would deteriorate because of the fragmentation of the empire, the loss of de facto control, etc. Also regional differences, as we will see now, so that circulation became more localized. Some anecdotes could be the one in 849, so after the Treaty of Verdun and the split of the empire into 3 chunks, when Lupus of Ferrières, planning to visit Rome, anticipated in a sense what he would have met there was this Italian silver coinage, as he calls Italica moneta argento, right? That he would have been different from his own, right? And kind of a peculiarity of that country. Italy, just by hint, I would say, had properly smaller types of coins, as with lighter types, and especially much less gold, but not much because of properly the availability, but rather because the elites were weaker in a sense, and it was more middle class exchange and so on. So let's start from the Western Frankish kingdom, that was de facto the heart of the Carolingian world, right? Concretely, and especially in Austria. And this was an era where the uniformity and quality of coinage were soon lost, right? France, as you know, had, or the Western Frankish kingdom, West Francia, or Francia if you prefer, was destined, let's say, to a rapid deterioration, mostly because of probably of the power of the local lordships, the higher concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer. So, that also for the future history, also in post-Carolingian, in Capetian times, was relatively a problem, right? France was, if you want, probably the least obvious of the kingdoms that could survive in post-Carolingian times as a unitary reality, right? The others, in a way or another, were all better placed, and instead ended up all basically failing as national monarchies in the centuries. I'd say that, during the early years of Charles the Bold, reign that, as you know, had managed to take over fundamentally the whole Western Frankish kingdom thanks to very shrewd policy, the sovereign worked to issue several coin types, right? But these efforts were not accompanied by general recoinages, right, as it had occurred at the time of Louis the Pious, and especially they seem not to have been so closely coordinated. It's even difficult, in fact, to reconstruct them historically speaking, and the whole picture shows fundamentally a weaker capacity of control on the whole process. It seems that outside of Aquitaine, that, as you know, was a kind of kingdom on its own and fundamentally different from a cultural point of view from the Frankish lands. The temple type seems to have been struck continuously in the name of Charles the Bald, and initially with the previous Christiana Religio reverse inscription, without mints originally, and eventually with the name of the mint. Later, several mints in the Western Frankish kingdom basically adopted their own distinctive sign, right? With an obvious, let's say, trend of localization in a sense. For example, a city gate at Chartres and Orléans, the mint name in field at Meaux, Paris and Saint, and a cross at Rheims, the Holy City. And in Aquitaine, the pattern of minting instead was more complicated, also because of the instability of the land that was ravaged by war, right, between Charles and the local Aquitanian ruler Pippin II. That went on for most of the 40s of the 9th century, but also because, as we've seen, Aquitaine, as a broader political rebellious direction, acted with more independently in many areas, but some centers were controlled by the Carolingians all the time, most important one especially. But still, there was a broader. It was properly a different land. Even historically, the Carolingians had somewhat colonized this place, having knocked it out as an independent rule, exploiting the same Islamic invasion of the region. So it was a different area, and it was also probably less. Well, okay, let's not say too much, but it probably was a lesser degree of centralization in the first place. Say that early in the reign of Charles, before the Treaty of Verdun of August 843, some deniers and obols were struck by Pippin II, in the name at least of his ally, the Emperor Lothar. This happened at Bordeaux. That was the most important Aquitanian city, at least properly in the hands of Aquitaine. As we will see, the Carolingian center for the rule of Aquitaine was Bourges. This is quite interesting because the support of Lothar, that was fighting bitterly against Charles the Bald as well, and that control, as we've seen, Italy and Lotharingia, tells us how Aquitaine was working in a sense to, of course, the consequences could not be quite predictable, but at that point it was understood that the unity of the empire was, far from being re-achieved. So the more they could weaken at that point, the Western Frankish kingdom, the better it was from their perspective. Also, Lothar would remain, as we were saying before, properly the next Carolingian emperor, so that was an extra reason to say, to tribute, to go by the book, right, and say, okay, that's effectively the emperor, so we should support him against his enemies. Eventually, Pippin coinage, in his own name, belongs, however, to the period dating 845-49, right, interrupting the issues of Charles the Bald, meaning probably that card of autonomization in favor of Lothar and against Charles had worked somewhat. In the early 40s of the 9th century, the means of Bourges, Melle, and Toulouse struck a monogram type for Charles, but in or before 845, at Bourges and Melle, This was changed for the mint sign temple in use at other West Frankish mints. So there was some sort of decrease, at least ideologically speaking, in this minting places to of properly Charles issue at that point. Toulouse had fallen to Pippin in late 842-43, and Mel also in 845, right? And at these mints, Pippin struck coins bearing his own monogram at that point. So that's even more. Probably this that distancing that we have seen from those mints probably paved the road. That's at least an indicator by itself of a greater disposition towards the same Aquitanian ambitions as we've seen. Pippin also minted coins at Bordeaux, Dax, and three new mints that were Cahors, Limoges, and Poitiers. So establishing properly new ones, which is a lot from a provincial ruler, let's say, or regional ruler. In English it's all the borderline is here. Aquitaine was big enough to count as even properly extensional, even more than Neustria. So it's meaningful how Pippin was acting as a monarch on his own regard at that point. And that's possibly exactly from this point that coins in the area start having the reverse inscription Aquitania, but no mint name as well. So it means that by strengthening his own power, Pippin took out this autonomistic stances from the local mints that were, as we've seen, were used to insert the name of the city on the coinage, and instead stressing this idea of unity of Aquitaine as such in a kind of national sense. In 848, Pippin even managed to capture Bourges, the capital of Aquitaine, from the Carolingians, and thus he issued a celebratory portrait coinage that was similar to that struck for his father in 817. However, also Pippin's success was short-lived. In fact, Charles the Bald regained, soon controlled the region, talking about 848 to 849, and he produced, in turn, his own version of the portrait coinage at Bourges. Again, a mint name infield type at Mel, so granting also this kind of local pride to the city, and the former monogram type at Toulouse. That was another very important strategical center, and for probably the defense also of the incursions from Spain, and controlling Aquitaine as well, and basically what had been formerly the Aquitanian capital back in the day. Now, there are also some coins of Charles the Bald from Clermont. One reading Aquitania, interestingly enough, was struck at Bordeaux and elsewhere, which cannot be dated precisely. So it's possible that Charles, so what integrated this Aquitanian, national indicator for appeasing also the local rulers in that sense of recognition of, their own identity, but still framed within his own, domination. The other coinage of Charles the Bald not only shows signs of weak administrative control, right, but it was quite soon evidently very debased. In fact, by the 60s of the 19th century, it contained no more than 1/2 of silver, so that loss in power was evident. By 864, Charles was, however, in position to reverse this trend. In fact, he undertook an ambitious reform of coinage, stressing uniformity mostly, but also reinforcing properly the amount of silver that rose to something like 96% on average. And on coinage, he, throughout all his kingdom, struck this legend, Gratia Dei Rex, right? So king by grace of God. Now, interestingly enough, we are documented about this reform through the Edict of Pitre or Pistre. We also made a video about that regarding encastellation on the MGH. It's, there is the extended. I think I inserted the link to the source in that video description. It was issued on June the 25th, 864. And we know exactly how the reform had to take place. Basically, on July the 1st, the count whose district within the kingdom a mint was situated was to send his viscount, right? So his man, then 2 men of property, so 2 properly agents of his, and the moneyers of the county to Senlis, where they would receive on loan 5 pounds of silver with which to begin minting, right? So it's interesting how they centralized in Senlis the precious metal. The counts from all the kingdom had to come there to receive this 5 pounds and to bring them back and mint on their own. Now, after Martinmas, so on November the 11th, the old coinage would have not longer be legal tender. So it was properly annulled. And the Edict of Pitre also limited the production to the palace and 10 named mints. But in practice, we know that across the whole Western Frankish kingdoms were something like 70 mints, right? And further 19 after the annexation of Lotharingia in 869. That's when Lothar had died, and basically Charles invaded the region and secured control, at least partially, on it. So, in spite, as we've seen, of Charles' wish to maintain, fundamentally centralize around 10 mints the coin production, such enormous spread of mints, and also in the newly conquered Lotharingian areas, which accounts overall for the 24 years of reign of the sovereign, probably responds to properly a need of ensuring coinage to be available for trade, and also more importantly for uniforming the perfection, say, the payment of taxes and other renders. So this doesn't mean that he had actually control all over the system, but also the same local lords needed this kind of interaction. And yet, and for this reason, the Gratia Dei Rex coinage, as we called it, had an enormous success that would last for a very long time. The design and inscriptions were immobilized at some mints until the 10th century, and sometimes even later, right? And this wasn't happening much because of the reinforcement of public authority. Quite the contrary, as we know exactly in these areas, the Western Frankish Kingdom, Lotharingia, these were the areas in which public authority evaporated the most in the whole post-Carolingian Europe. This rather speaks for the rise of some of the local lords, lay and ecclesiastical alike. Famously enough, in this tormented time, the Viking incursions, these areas were hit very hard, by the way, and the taking over of local counts and bishops to control the cities, properly also what the mints were, and from which normally they would rule from, as in the Gallo-Roman Frankish tradition, that would start profiting from the coinage itself, right? The abbots of Corbie, for example, were so powerful that they put their initial monogram on the coins, right? A practice that later on would become even more widespread. Then passing to Italy and Lotharingia, so-called, during the reign of Lothar, 840, 855, we are talking about, in fact, kind of an heterogeneous area, stretching from Frisia to Provence was included, by the way, and south of the Alps to Italy. So there were fundamentally three different countries, and if not more concretely. As you know, this area wouldn't survive unitarily much, at least after Lothar's death. Lotharingia was a non-center of power factually, or at least was very fragmented. Italy was, Provence was, but still they, on the long run, they wouldn't develop kind of a strong central power. Well, not post-Carolingian power fundamentally managed to, but at least the Eastern Frankish kingdom at some point revived in the 10th century its capacity of reconnecting with other kingdoms, fundamentally and incidentally connecting with Italy and Provence themselves, and in part with Lotharingia, but still remaining internally divided, as even in their fundamentally different countries on their own. I'm sorry that I haven't made at this point enough videos on these topics because I guess these are fairly well-known dynamics in the history of medieval Europe, but still I think we never covered them, and they're less they're less simple than they sound. Actually, we're quite complicated. Also, properly determining how concretely how much power it was quite. But at least in the 9th century, let's say Louis the Pious son's generations did maintain some control, right, up to fundamentally the reconnection with Charles III in 888, where basically everything went downhill directly. Which were the means of Lothar's possessions? Well, his coinage was mainly struck at Dorestad, and in Italy, at the main four mints were Milan, Pavia, Treviso, and Venice. Now, Venice is quite fascinating if you think about that, because it technically didn't belong to the empire. It was actually the Venetians regarded themselves as Byzantine subjects still. Charlemagne back in the day, in 811, if I'm not wrong, had made a deal with them. The Carolingians had tried to take Venice, but they fundamentally failed. Also, Charlemagne's son died of malaria in the lagoons during the siege. It was actually a pretty, and it was a very important area because Venice, together with other centers that had surpassed by that point, such as Comacchio, was fundamentally monopolizing the, at least from the Italic kingdom's perspective, that as the Carolingians had acquired control of with traffics with the East, broadly meant not just Constantinople, but the East, also Muslims, etc. The salt mines were present there as well, so everything was exported into Central Europe via the Po River in Lombardy, and so it was extremely important to extend, if Venice could not be conquered militarily, but at least some kind of subjection. The Venetians knew how to play this very cleverly, so much that they adopted, as we have seen, properly a Carolingian coinage. In fact, towards the end of Louis the Pious' reign already, Venice had struck coins of the temple type, with inscriptions such as Dominus conserva Roman Imperator, or "Oh God, preserve the Emperor of the Romans," or Domine salva Venetias, written also in different ways, such as XPE, which means would be Christus Domine, or at least the acronym, or Christ save Venice. Right, and it's fascinating because there is no reference to which emperor the salute was addressed to. Lothar's Italian coins were of the mint naming field type, albeit his successors reverted to the Christiana Religio Temple one, struck on flints that grew progressively thinner and much larger than the dice, right? So it was very flat and very wide by the end of the 9th century. Also somewhat fragile, right? Also made, I imagine, for archaeological finds and so on. Now in Rome, the papal coinage, the silver denarii, continued to acknowledge the Carolingian emperor, right? This was important because, as you know, the papal policy revolving around the, this being in between the two empires and playing even there very cleverly. But at this point, the popes had opted for the West, while lots of swings would have remained according to convenience. After the death of Louis the Pious, the Frankish weight standard of the papal silver denarii of 1.75 grams would be abandoned, though, in favor of a lower one of around 1.3 grams, right? And it's possible that this responded to some earlier Roman weight system that was retained in the city. Now there is an even, you see, Rome was, the papacy already had a kind of lordships on its own, and was kind of the southern fringe of the empire. The Carolingians would try to extend notoriously their control on southern Italy as well, and this area was instead much more complicated to even properly claim sovereignty on, mostly because of the Apenninic nature of the territory, how the southern Longobards duchies had entrenched in these fortified centers and so on. The main one being Benevent, right? And here, denarii of Carolingian fabric, but for most part of novel design, were struck to a standard of around 1.4 grams, right? Falling in the second quarter of the 9th century to 1.3 grams. All this indicates probably more kind of more activity in middle classes, like less of a feudal reality than it was in Central Europe. And a Carolingian ruler is referred to on Beneventan coinage on just 2 occasions. Once was when Grimoald the Third, 788-806, ruler of Benevent, was obliged to recognize Charlemagne's overlordship during the first 2 years of his reign. So both the coins both carry their names. The second occasion instead was during 866-71, when Louis II campaigned from Italy against the Arabs in the south and made himself master of Benevent, where he struck some denarii, some in the joint names of himself and his wife Angilberga. Now, this thing wouldn't last for particularly long, because eventually the Italic kingdom would decline after the death of Louis II, and there was no capacity even to project power so far as Benevent. Benevent was, you see, it was technically part of it. There was a great ambiguity in this whole thing, right? Because simply this was the far south frontier, and there was no much way properly to revive control on it on a long run. It had been under Longobard times in the same way. They technically fit within the kingdom, but and it was relatively easy even to march on them, at least in Longobard times, to reinstate royal rule. But at the death of the local appointee, the local duke would resume their own autonomistic policy, and things would go on more or less like that, without even particular attrition. The problem is rather here was intensified, like the clash was stronger compared to Longobard times, because now the southern Longobard duchies were in between, literally, Carolingian and Byzantine territory in the same Italy. So the Longobards, even there, played it very cleverly, because they managed to retain control, even to switch from the duchy to principality, and remaining, as you know, until Norman times, for therefore another 200 years independent. And there was always this mixed allegiance, for which even adopting, I don't know, Carolingian coinage and figures, etc., was a way of appeasing that sense, that ruler or the other being, but still retaining fundamentally an autonomy. and remaining so at the end of the day. Speaking of Germany instead, right, Eastern Frankish kingdom, this was assigned famously to Louis, known as the German, as a consequence, who ruled between 840 876. This was also a troubled area, especially in the northeastern frontier against the Slavs. There was an important military fort. Would be the Stellinger revolt. I mean, lots of interesting things that we'll have to cover at some point. It wasn't an easy area to control at all because there wasn't any previous statal reality, and the land was difficult to transition into a feudal one because the society was much less stratified. The elites were poorer, so it was much more complicated. So there were important differences that are reflected in coinage as well. The area we're talking about would be old Germany east of the Rhine, plus the cities of Mainz, Worms, and Speyer on the west bank, right? And this was expanded in 870 after the death of Lothar II to incorporate part of Lotharingia, such as Cologne, that had been also essentially the original lands which Carolingians seized control, Trier, Metz, Strasbourg, Basel, Toul, and Liège. So very important cities actually. The latter two especially were shared with Charles the Bald, with Western Frankish king, because of this frontier areas we've seen in Lotharingia that didn't quite have a center point of gravity, floated between the two areas. Outside the Rhineland and Bavaria, that were the most Romanized and Frankicized lands, Germany fundamentally had a non-monetary economy. Right? We can't understand this easily, not just through lots of other things, but judging from the pattern of minting and of coin finds in the first place. Right? So it's not a coincidence that Louis the Pious had struck in his time coinage in the area at Cologne, Mainz, Strasbourg, Regensburg, so the most properly Roman cities par excellence, and three other unidentified mints actually, probably all situated in Germany. It's just we don't know where exactly. They were in the sources named as Alabotteshain, Aldumheim, and Stoltenburg. And only the coins attributable to Louis the Germans before 870 are the ones from Mainz, right? Thereafter, the coins of Louis and his successors are basically almost entirely the ones struck in their Lotharingian territories to the west of the Rhineland, right? So this tells you how properly towards the, and also later with Arnulf of Carinthia, who was Eastern Frankish king between 887 and 899, there was the striking of a substantial coinage at Mainz, right, and a small issue at Regensburg. But it was only under Louis the Child, 899 and 911, that the Rhineland mints of Cologne and Strasbourg were brought back into operation after an interval of 60 years or more. So you see here how, even in here, naturally, the capacity of minting was connected to the stability of the rule. Germany was all fragmented, as we've seen, this kind of so-called ethnic duchies that were still, there was a few ethnic remained, rather than the local elites that, Frankicized elites that now were struggling for remaining autonomous from a central rule, and this surely didn't help at all. And even some of the most important centers, such as Cologne, right here, remained, for example, without a functioning and operational mint for a long time. So you understand how far from a concrete political territorial power that this area of concrete and properly of monetary circulation internally it really was, right? And the most important minting centers were activated were in the presence of stronger rule that mostly overlapped with some of the most advanced, the most developed areas of the country in the west and the south. Coin finds from the 8th and 9th century in the Eastern Frankish kingdom present a similar pattern, They're relatively plentiful, again, in the most developed areas of the Rhineland, in Bavaria, considering that in the Rhineland especially there were very important traffics, also armor production, etc. So it was a considerable trade flow, while further east and north, coin finds are very scarce. Right? You wouldn't use it. It was much more of a barter reality. It was more primitive and less properly, monetized. But properly, there were less cities. There weren't cities historically. The Carolingians would found them, so they it was a very different reality. It would be just as we were saying before under the Ottonians, the Saxon kings, that the expansion of minting and coin circulation in Germany would properly take a great turn expansion, and at that point it was connected, however, to a broader system. That at that point was mostly the Saxons, Franconian axis, Saxony being poorer, more warlike, but Franconia being properly the land of the Franks. That's the most Frankicized area in Germany, and the most productive in the surroundings, and properly the capacity of recompacting political unity around the military capacity of the Ottonians, the revival of the empire with the formal reannexation of the Italic kingdom, and all this that we know historically having happened and having enlarged dramatically. At this point, it's not about Germany itself, it's about the empire altogether, in these other areas that supported the project as such, that were also way richer in that sense, and that's exactly where the Ottonians went for, because in Germany it was much, let's say, less to profit, and to that would properly change even the ideological use of coin, properly the inscriptions, the iconography, etc. in a Roman sense. Properly the Ottonians were the ones that went for, they basically crossed out Frankish or Saxon. They instated the Romanity as the sole possible universal dimension of the empire, and having to propagate it with dramatic and very refined propaganda capacity. We've seen with the revival in letters, in ideology, in a comprehensive philosophical, scientific, at least funding for such activities, etc. That would have to reassert the universality in the empire, not the locality anymore. And coins represent this, and there are lots of also Byzantine influence, as you know, in the same dynasty, and a very different era that we'll have to talk about in another video. Alright, so for today I stop it here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.